And now I will turn things over to Carrie.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Well, I was just thinking how powerful those quotes were that you collected and how well they represent, I think, the full range of people's experiences with this. That, families are complicated and no two families are alike, and people are going to experience these things differently. I was thinking how it could be a hard choice in some cases for a family caregiver to make, to accept, the paying position of becoming a family caregiver and potentially giving up other career options. But I also just keep thinking that it's so important that people have that choice. It may not be the right choice for everyone, but just to be able to have it, I think, is so key. So I really appreciate all of those quotes. So I wanted to just encourage our participants, our audience, to share with us through the questions and answers, that little pod on the lower left side of the screen, any questions you have or comments for our panelists. We appreciate both comments and questions. We did actually get a couple of questions in as our presenters were speaking. So while you all are thinking, if you have additional comments, I may just start with a couple of those. So when Merle was presenting about some of the research about the value of paying family caregivers, he referenced the Valuing the Invaluable report that AARP has put out, I guess, several times. The most recent edition was in 2019, and it found that the care being provided by unpaid family caregivers was worth, in economic terms, $470 billion. So $500 billion of care, roughly. And somebody asked what that was based on. And I think Casey may be able to put that report actually in the resources for this webinar today, so you can access it. But there's a section about methodology that describes it, and it's really interesting. It's AARP used a combination of caregiver surveys, so actually asking caregivers about their experiences, but individual surveys too. There were 4 public surveys, including BRFIS and long-term care surveys. So those surveys were used to collect information about kind of caregiving patterns and how many hours of care were being provided. And then there were data from the Department of Labor and other sources about state minimum wage and median wages paid to home health care workers and personal care workers, then to estimate what it would have cost if those families had hired someone outside the family. So if you replace, all of the hours that the family caregivers were providing with paid care, that's essentially where the $500 billion comes from, which is pretty staggering. So I hope that helped answer the question, but certainly, check out that report, Valuing the Invaluable, and you could send us an email, or if there's anything else you want to know about it. It is fascinating. So let me just see. So, this question I wanted to open up for the panel because I think it's a very interesting question. So for Lori or Merle or Ellen, somebody was asking if you are aware of any differences in how paid family caregivers for seniors kind of experience the being paid, I guess, versus when they're supporting someone who with an intellectual or developmental disability. And the person suggested that, if this is a young adult directing their own services, they may not want a family caregiver like a parent, being the one, especially when it comes to kind of, developing community connections outside the house, outside the family. And I just wondered if any of your research, either from what you talked about today or from the past, addresses any differences in people's experiences, whether it's caring for, a senior, someone with a traumatic brain injury, someone with an intellectual developmental disability. Any differences in those areas?
So, Carrie, yes, I will say one, I think, very important point that I learned in the study that I did at Paralyzed Veterans of America all those years ago, and that was really my introduction to the disability philosophy, which the language, I'll just say very briefly, the language has changed over the years, but it started out as consumer-directed and morphed into person-centered. And so I always think it's important to acknowledge that whole philosophy that the aging world has taken on came from that community. And and so just long story short, before I answer your question is, I went from the aging community to the disability community, and then it became my goal to take that philosophy and introduce it to the aging community, because there was such a huge difference. One is an empowerment philosophy, and the other is, taking it to the aging community that, before this was introduced, was very much not empowered at all. It was a philosophy of, they're there, honey, we know better. And so it was so important to be able to bring that to the aging community, and that has happened. But in doing that work, one of the things that has always stayed with me was some of the younger people with disabilities, and these were people with paralyzed veterans. One of the very powerful statements was, there were two things. One was, my wife is my wife and my caregiver is my caregiver. I want them to be separate people. I don't want my caregiving to be part of my marriage. And so, clearly this is all about choice. And, someone, who feels that way, should not have their spouse as their caregiver. So, this is, very much who is the person and what is their choice. Right. Another really powerful thing that I, again, remember all of these years later from those interviews was one of the women who did not identify herself as a caregiver. And that was pretty common. And her statement was, after saying all of the things that she did, was, in summary, I just do the things that you do for all those men, which was so telling. And she did not, she was taking care of a spouse who was paralyzed, but that was not caregiving to her.
So interesting.
Yeah, they taught me a lot.
Yeah, and I'll just join in quickly and say I think that Lori's basic point, I think, is a critical one, and that is, we're really talking about person-centered. This is a person-centered question, less than a population question. What works for that individual, and listening to the individual. My guess is, and this is an educated guess, it comes not from it comes from clinical experience of working across populations. Is I think you would see some different trends within different populations. I think that it would look a little different within the senior population, with the physical disability population, with the intellectual disability population, and so on and so forth. But my guess is, more importantly, the differences within those populations are probably much more are broader than the across population differences. So that just to get back to, therefore, that real issue here is what is the correct care collection for that person to meet his or her needs and preferences.
Yeah, that's a great point, that it really is just very person specific, what's going to be the most comfortable and most effective, for that individual person. Right. Lori, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. What you just said, Carrie, really speaks to what I was mentioning very briefly earlier, in that the way people think about this option is very related to the way they think about families. And you'll hear people make, some very broad statements about, the care is so much better because it's a family member who loves this person and knows them well. And that is very true for those families and those relationships that fit that description. But as we know, there's a broad continuum of how families function or don't. And so, again, it's choice based on each family circumstance. For those families that get along and are very functional, it can be wonderful. But you'd never want to impose that on a family that is not so functional.
Yeah, very good point. So I wanted to just let everybody know that we have had a lot of questions come in, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to answer them all, but there were a couple that I think actually I might be able to kind of combine, and then hopefully we'll have time in just the next few minutes. Let's see. But so somebody was asking about whether this panel has had experience where there is resistance among case managers who might be in the position of, explaining this option to people, and as they're trying to choose between a more traditional option and self-direction or participant direction, the case manager might actually kind of be pushing them away from self-direction because, they're worried maybe that, it's not going to be a great situation, or so any comments about that. But kind of related to that, can you say anything about whether we know, do people of all races and ethnicities have access to this model? Like, do we know that people with, Black and Indigenous and people of color, are they using this model as well? Do we know anything about whether they're more or less likely to hire family members? Does that have to do with, what case managers are saying to people in different areas? Or I think that issue of access often has to do with how it's explained and how it's offered, and that might be different depending on who they're talking to. So I wondered.
So I can speak to some of our early experience with cash and counseling, because we addressed those exact issues that came up, and so we did a lot of focus groups to learn about consumers' preferences for a cash option, which, as I said, that project became a story about hiring family caregivers, and so I can say two things. One is we had the experience of attending a training session for the people who were going to be case managers in one state as that project was getting off the ground. And what we heard was that case managers felt very strongly that this was an option. And what I'm referring to now is the, being in this program, which became an option about hiring family caregivers, but they felt it was appropriate for younger people. They didn't feel it was appropriate for older people, and so they pretty much told older people, well, here's an option, but you're really not, you're not going to be interested in this. And so the upshot of that was the end of training that group, and that state made a decision that they had to find other case managers, of saying to people who didn't have this idea of who it was for and who it wasn't for. So yes, this was a really strong example of what happens when case managers have strong views, and they're the ones doing the outreach. And you can't have people who are doing outreach explaining a program and saying, no, it is for you or it is not for you. Your other question about different racial and ethnic groups. So when we did a 4-state survey to find out about preferences for this cash option, and in the surveys we then followed up with focus groups to understand the survey findings in more depth. And what happened was we learned very clearly that different racial and ethnic groups were much more interested. And because of that finding, we organized the follow-up focus groups specifically around that finding. So we had groups for African Americans with an African American moderator, groups for Hispanic, Spanish-speaking participants with a Hispanic moderator to learn just that. And so we did learn some very strong statements, again, all these years later. It's very stronger preference. We take care of our own. That was really important. We don't put people in nursing homes. We take care of our own. And they wanted to be able to hire someone who understood their culture, their values, their food. Now, I want to be able to have someone who can go to a store and pick out, the right fruit and vegetables for me to make the foods that are important to me. So really strong statements about all of that.
Thank you. Yes, and I know there have been articles written about this topic that perhaps we could share too. We decided, because there's so many questions, we're going to take just one more, and for those of you that need to disconnect, that's fine. We're so glad you were able to join us and be with us. We will continue to record this, so if you have time later and you want to listen to this last bit, you can. But a very good question came in about the issue of how these payments are considered. If they're wages, are they taxed?
Yes.
How do caregivers get retirement benefits? What impact does it have kind of in the long run on these caregivers that are that are being paid, or what other financial implications? So any quick responses to that question from any of you?
Again, I will say very quickly, in the cash and counseling demonstration evaluation, it was a requirement that they were wages and that people had to pay taxes.
And I'll just jump in and say that is generally true. There are some tax variations for folks that are indeed live-in caregivers, and if it's seen as a kind of part of providing family shelter, if it's a difficulty of care payment. So there are ways that my advice to a family member would be to talk to your FMS provider in some detail about how this can work, because in fact the tax situation can get a little complicated because it depends on how you structure it. Lori's fundamentally right. They're employees, but that because of their being family members and such, and they're living in the household, the tax situation can get a little squishy. And you're going to want to be really careful about that. And that's why God gave us financial management services.
Right. Yes. Thanks all of you on the phone who are doing that good work. All right. Well, I think we really do need to wrap up there, but thanks to our panelists. This has been terrific information to get. I really appreciate hearing from all of you, and thank you all for joining us. And Casey, is there anything else you need to say in conclusion?
No, just a big thank you to you, Carrie, for moderating, and I will be following up afterwards with a copy of the slides and the recording. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next week for more of our sessions in this conference series. Have a great day.